Late on February 28, 1986, Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme left a Stockholm movie theater with his wife Lisbeth after a spontaneous night out with their son and his girlfriend. Palme had no security detail with him. He had declined a bodyguard that evening, which was not unusual for his private outings. As the couple walked home, a man came up behind them and fired 2 shots at close range. One bullet struck Palme in the back, fatally severing his carotid artery, and the second narrowly missed Lisbeth. Bystanders rushed to help as the perpetrator fled into the darkness. An ambulance brought Palme to the hospital, but just after midnight he was pronounced dead. The shocking slaying of a national leader on a public street left Sweden in disbelief and immediately raised the urgent question of who was responsible and why. Olof Palme was not a typical head of government. He was a charismatic social democratic leader and an outspoken internationalist who had led Sweden on and off since the 1960s. Palme's candid criticism of the regime in South Africa and his anti-colonial views earned him as many enemies as admirers. At home and abroad, conservatives reviled him, and some even spread rumors he was a secret KGB agent, while others hailed him as a champion of human rights. This divisiveness meant there was no shortage of potential foes. The immediate police response to Palme's attack was plagued by mistakes that would haunt the case. Crucially, officers failed to promptly seal off the crime scene, allowing bystanders to walk through and possibly destroy evidence. Communication breakdowns added to the chaos. For example, an early emergency call about the act was misdirected and never reached police in time. Other basic failures have been noted in the aftermath of the event. For instance, in the critical first hours, the perimeter around the area of the attack wasn't closed, and roadblocks along major arteries were extremely slow to roll out. As days turned to weeks, public confidence in the investigation waned. Under intense pressure to solve the crime, authorities poured seemingly unlimited resources into the hunt. Yet the investigation, led for a time by Stockholm Police Chief Hans Holmer, became chaotic, focusing on flashy but unproductive tactics while overlooking basic police work. For instance, Holmer held frequent press conferences of questionable value and even deployed military fighter jets to scour the city for the weapon. And no, you don't have to replay that part. Fighter jets were out there looking for a figurative needle in a haystack. You would think if they wanted to deploy some air power for this investigation, helicopters would be a more sensible choice than fighter jets. But hey, that's just my view. Meanwhile, more routine police work suffered. One veteran journalist noted that officers messed up routine tasks and failed to properly follow up on critical evidence in the early days. Perhaps the biggest blow to the case came in 1989, when prosecutors did manage to convict a suspect, only to have the verdict overturned due to serious police errors. One of the earliest and most persistent theories is that Palme was slain by a lone individual acting independently, rather than as part of a wider effort. The chief embodiment of this theory is Christer Peterson, a petty criminal who became the prime suspect in the late 1980s. Peterson was a local substance user and alcoholic with a history of extreme violence. And I'm not exaggerating here when I say extreme violence. He had already been in prison once for ending another life. In December 1988, nearly 3 years after the slaying, police arrested him after Palme's widow picked him out of a lineup as the man who committed the act. The following year, Peterson was convicted of the crime, seemingly providing closure to the case. However, the conviction was soon overturned by a higher court. The appeals court ruled that the evidence was insufficient and unreliable. Investigators had never produced the alleged weapon, and Peterson's motive for attacking Palme was unclear, but these were comparatively minor issues. Crucially, police had mishandled the lineup by tipping off Lisbeth Palme that the suspect had a severe drinking problem. Notably, Peterson appeared extremely disheveled while all the other men were well put together in comparison. She chose Peterson explicitly on the basis that he was the one who appeared to have a drinking problem and not entirely based on her own recollection. Notably, after being acquitted, Peterson reportedly boasted to his friends that he actually committed the crime. However, there's no evidence to suggest he did, and all evidence suggests that he was simply an extremely violent individual with a loose connection to reality. Another version of the lone wolf theory gained traction in recent years, focusing on a man who was at the scene but long overlooked as a suspect. Stig Engstrom was among the bystanders on the scene, and he built up something of a media profile in the years following the event. Engstrom openly disliked Palma's left-leaning politics and had significant weapons training from his military service. Decades after the crime, journalists and investigators pieced together inconsistencies in Engstrom's story. Multiple witnesses had described a man fleeing the scene who strongly resembled Engstrom, yet Engstrom himself claimed he stayed and tried to help. He gave statements about his movements that night which did not match known timelines, and he seemed oddly eager to insert himself into the media narrative of the crime. In a dramatic press conference 34 years after Palma's death, the chief prosecutor named Stig Engstrom as the prime suspect and formally closed the investigation. The only reason the case was closed is that Stig had passed away in the year 2000. Officials conceded that there was no direct evidence tying him to the act, but they argued that the accumulated clues pointed to Engstrom and no other suspect. This announcement was met with mixed reactions. While some observers felt the mystery had at last been solved, others criticized the conclusion as speculative and unfulfilling. In viewing the evidence, I understand why so many in Sweden were left empty with this announcement. There was no hard evidence whatsoever indicating he actually did it. It looks as though he could have been an individual who just wanted to insert himself into a high-profile police investigation. Anyway, I'll come back to this in a moment, after I discuss some of the other theories of the case. Another leading theory stretches far beyond Sweden's borders, pointing the finger at the South African Intelligence Service. Stunning allegations to this effect emerged in 1996, when a former South African police officer testified in court that his country's security forces were behind Palma's attack. He named a variety of known South African spies and mercenaries as being in on the job. Olof Palme was a vocal opponent of South Africa's regime. Just a week before his death, he had given a fiery speech condemning their system of governance and declaring it had to be abolished. Swedish investigators flew to South Africa to follow up on these leads. They interviewed witnesses and suspects, but ultimately found no evidence to substantiate any of the claims. The government had fallen by then, and no official records ever tied South African intelligence definitively to the crime. Despite the lack of evidence, a former head of Swedish intelligence went on the record indicating that forces within South African intelligence were his top suspects in the crime. Among the more disturbing theories are those that suggest the act was an inside job carried out or covered up by figures within Sweden's own police or security services. Given the errors in the investigation, some have wondered if malice, and not just incompetence, played a role in the failure to catch the perpetrator. This line of speculation usually points to Palma's domestic enemies. Palma had aroused intense hatred from certain circles in Sweden, including some elements within the police and military due to his liberal policies. Another theory suggests that, as improbable as it may sound, the entire event was simply a random act of violence. Notably, Palma was out and about without a security detail, and it's been suggested that the perpetrator may have simply targeted him at random. While this sounds improbable, it's technically a possibility as well. Almost 40 years later, the authorities are no closer to solving the events of February 28, 1986. Personally, I suspect that due to the police mishandling of the initial investigation, we'll never get a clear resolution to the case. The police announcing that Stig Engstrom was likely the perp, and then closing out the case, feels to me like an attempt at saving face by the Swedish police. I don't understand how they could say with such certainty that they had enough evidence to close the case based on the evidence they presented publicly. I suspect that if Stig were alive, there wouldn't have even been enough evidence to convict him based on the very weak circumstantial case presented. Anyway, if you're Swedish or follow this case closely, I'd love to hear your take on what happened in the comments below. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to share this video with your friends and family and post it on your socials. This is the best way you can ensure that my channel keeps growing and that I can keep spending all my time on working to bring you great new content. Nikola Tesla was a visionary inventor whose New York City laboratory was a hub of groundbreaking electrical experiments in the 1890s. By 1895, Tesla's lab on South Fifth Avenue had become the epicenter of his research into alternating current, wireless lighting, and early radio technology. The equipment and prototypes housed there represented years of work and innovation. All of that changed in a single night when a sudden blaze consumed the building, marking a devastating turn in Tesla's career. In the early morning hours before dawn on March 13th, 1895, disaster struck Tesla's lab. A fire broke out in the downtown Manhattan building at the South Fifth Avenue unit that housed his workspace on the 4th floor. A night watchman on duty had just been tending the basement furnace. When he returned to the ground floor, he discovered flames had completely engulfed everything. He exited the building and alerted the authorities immediately. By the time firefighters arrived, flames were roaring through the stairwells and the elevator shaft of the 6-story structure. The building was also occupied by a steam fitter supply company, and the floors were soaked with machine oils that helped the flames spread with frightening speed. Firefighters battled the inferno for over 3 hours, but the structure burned quickly. The heat grew so intense it even ignited parts of a nearby elevated railway line. By dawn, the fire was finally controlled, but Tesla's lab was completely destroyed. The entire 4th floor collapsed into the stories below, burying the remnants of Tesla's machinery, tools, and notes under charred debris. When morning came, the extent of the loss was clear. Virtually all of Tesla's inventions, equipment, and research notes had been reduced to ashes. Priceless models and prototypes, including those Tesla had displayed at the 1893 World's Fair, were gone. Tesla was crushed by this sudden ruin. Witnesses say he paced in front of the smoldering wreckage in disbelief and grief. Financially, the fire was a severe blow. Tesla estimated at least $50,000 in damage to his work, an absolutely huge sum at the time, and none of it was insured. The scientific community and the public responded with an outpouring of sympathy. Newspapers lamented the calamity, with one editorial calling the destruction of Tesla's lab a misfortune to the whole world. For investigators, the pressing question was what sparked the blaze. Official inquiries at the time were hampered by the complete destruction of the interior, but they determined that the fire started on the building's ground floor, well below Tesla's lab. All evidence pointed to an accident. The ground level and basement were work areas filled with flammable substances, making them prime candidates for the fire's origin. One likely scenario was that an open flame, such as a gas light the watchman left burning, ignited the oil-soaked surroundings. The blaze's rapid spread was clearly fueled by the building's hazardous contents. Investigators found no indication of foul play or sabotage. In their report, the fire was ultimately attributed to an unfortunate accident, a common hazard in an era of open gas lighting and combustible materials. Over time, several alternative theories have emerged to explain the cause of the 1895 lab fire. Some have wondered if one of Tesla's own experimental devices or electrical systems might have triggered the fire. Some modern theorists have wondered if a machine could have overheated, or a stray spark from a high voltage coil could have smoldered and ignited something after hours. This theory, however, isn't backed by contemporary reports or evidence. Tesla and his assistants had left for the night, and the blaze, according to all evidence that we have, began on a different floor. Perhaps the most common theory is that the fire was no accident at all, but an intentional act by someone who wanted to halt Tesla's work. Tesla's breakthroughs with alternating current and his futuristic ideas made him a high-profile figure who some rivals or industrial interests might have seen as a threat. In this scenario, a competitor or disgruntled foe could have set the blaze on purpose to sabotage him. However, there is no proof of any such plot. The official investigation found no hint of arson, and Tesla himself never accused anyone of wrongdoing. Given their history of bad blood, Thomas Edison is frequently hinted at as the mastermind behind the fire. While it's entirely possible that industrial sabotage was involved, especially given the state of forensic investigations in 1895, there's simply no evidence to support it. Personally, I see the more interesting mystery here as not how the fire started, or if one of Tesla's rivals was involved. Rather, I wonder what sort of state-of-the-art inventions went up in smoke, and what exactly was contained in his lost papers. Given the exponential nature of scientific progress, and given that the fire happened in 1895, I have to wonder how much more advanced we would be if it hadn't happened. Well, I mean, it wouldn't be us, but the equivalent humans in the same situation. Mike Herron was a 51-year-old father of two from Tennessee who vanished under baffling circumstances in 2008. He split his time between a condo in Maryville and a 100-acre farm in the remote Happy Valley area adjacent to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Also, I swear the Smokies come up so much in my videos, I could probably create a 2-hour Smokies compilation. Mike ran a construction business and was an avid outdoorsman who had even worked as a national park trail cutter. On the morning of August 23, 2008, Mike headed out to work on his farm. He called his sons to let them know he'd be out of contact, since cell phone reception there was poor. After picking up a lawnmower from one son's house, he arrived at the Happy Valley property. Around 11 a.m., neighbors saw Mike leaving his farmhouse on a green Yamaha Wolverine ATV, waving as he drove down Bell Branch Road. This was the last confirmed sighting of him. Over the next 2 days, Mike's family became concerned when they couldn't reach him. On August 24th, friends noticed his pickup truck parked at the end of his driveway, with a trailer and mower still attached. This was odd, since he usually would have unloaded the equipment and moved the truck closer to the house. Mike's parents checked on him that day and found no sign of their son, and the grass he intended to mow was untouched. Panic didn't set in just yet, though, especially since he owned a large property and also spent a significant amount of time in the outdoors, where he disconnected from the outside world. By Monday, August 25th, with no word from Mike, his sons went to the farm and also visited his Maryville home. They found his car and motorcycle still in the garage and discovered that Mike's keys, cell phone, wallet with cash and cards, and even his weapon were left inside the truck at the farm. Authorities launched a large search operation in the rugged area as soon as Mike was reported missing. Heavy rain rolled in on Monday evening, likely washing away tracks and scent trails. Despite this, more than 100 people joined the search, including sheriff's deputies, national park rangers, state wildlife officers, and local volunteers. They covered roughly 450 acres of woods and about 50 miles of trails over the next several days, together with search dogs and a chopper. Yet the exhaustive effort found absolutely no trace of Mike. A single concrete clue turned up on Tuesday, August 26th. A family friend discovered Mike's missing ATV abandoned in dense brush about a mile from his house. It lay on a steep hillside near an old cabin, close to the national park boundary. The ATV was undamaged, but it had been left in high gear with the ignition switch on and the battery fully drained. Mike's sons noted he was meticulous and would never leave his four-wheeler running like that unless something was very wrong. The location was also off course according to his sons and wasn't near any path Mike normally took. While finding the ATV was a critical development, it didn't solve the mystery, not even close. There were no footprints, torn clothing, or any sign of a struggle around it. Searchers intensified their efforts in that area but found nothing else. After weeks of searching, no further evidence turned up, and the sheriff publicly acknowledged that the lack of clues was baffling. In the absence of clear evidence, several theories have been proposed to explain Mike's disappearance. One possibility is that Mike had an accident in the woods. Perhaps he walked away from his ATV and fell or got injured. However, the ATV's condition and the thorough search of the area make an accident seem doubtful. If he were lost or hurt nearby, searchers likely would have found some trace of him, but they found nothing at all. Notably, the area is home to black bears and other wildlife, so some wonder if a bear attack could explain his disappearance. Authorities found no evidence of any animal attack or any signs of a large predator in the area. Without any such signs, an animal encounter is considered unlikely, though admittedly the weather conditions could have covered up such evidence. The most common theory, however, is that Mike met with foul play. Mike might have interrupted illegal activity on his property, such as trespassers or a hidden substance operation, and been silenced by someone who didn't want to be caught. According to his sons, he was known to confront intruders on his land, or his neighbor's land, though in the past it appears they had been there unintentionally and non-maliciously. According to one of his sons, if he had seen anything suspicious going down, he would have immediately confronted that person or people. All these factors make foul play a strong possibility, even though no proof of a struggle or any crime whatsoever has been found. Another theory is that Mike chose to disappear intentionally, which appears to me to be a more absurd theory than usual in this case. This theory seems to get brought up in every missing person case, and usually there's something to suggest this was the case. Perhaps the person who went missing was in debt, or their life wasn't going well in other ways. With Mike, all evidence suggests he was a successful business owner who owned a large piece of land and had a happy family. Is there such a thing as a boring number? The interesting number paradox is a famous logical puzzle that tackles this question. It starts by attempting to label natural numbers as either interesting, having some notable property, or uninteresting. At first, this seems reasonable. Surely some large random numbers have nothing special about them. However, a clever twist in logic shows a contradiction. If any number were truly uninteresting, it would become interesting by virtue of being the smallest uninteresting number. In other words, every natural number can be argued to be interesting. This outcome is why it's called a paradox. It defies the initial expectation that boring numbers exist. The reasoning behind the interesting number paradox is usually presented as a proof by contradiction. It goes like this. Assume there are some uninteresting numbers. If so, there must be a smallest uninteresting number in that group, because the natural numbers have a well-defined order starting from 1. For the purposes of explaining this potential paradox, let's call this number n. By being the lowest number with nothing interesting about it, n suddenly has a unique property. It is the first number with no interesting traits. That very status makes it interesting. This is a contradiction. N can't be both uninteresting and interesting at the same time. Therefore, our initial assumption must be wrong. The conclusion is that there are no uninteresting numbers, meaning every number is interesting in some way. Despite its interesting conclusion, the interesting number paradox isn't a formal mathematical theorem. It's more of a logical trick that hinges on how we define interesting versus boring. One key limitation is that interestingness is subjective. The paradox arises from an incredibly subjective definition of what makes a number interesting. Essentially, the act of declaring a number uninteresting gives it a new property by default, meaning our original definition was flawed. If we try to formally split numbers into interesting versus uninteresting, the boundary between the two sets breaks down. The smallest so-called uninteresting number can't consistently belong in either category, meaning that the uninteresting set just simply doesn't exist. If we accept the paradox, no natural number is uninteresting. However, this doesn't mean that all natural numbers are equally interesting, given that interestingness is a linguistic term rather than a mathematical term. But that raises the question whether something like a prime number without linguistic significance is more interesting in the context of this thought experiment. Also, as I'm editing this, just to clear that up, prime numbers don't have linguistic significance outside of a mathematical frame of reference. So put down your pitchforks, please. Notably, most mathematicians disagree that this is an actual paradox, but rather a byproduct of non-mathematical language. All that said, this fails to account for the fact that on a linguistic level, it does represent a paradoxical situation as relates to specifically defined number sets. The phenomenon commonly referred to as Truman Show disorder is a rare psychiatric issue in which an individual believes they're the star of a reality television show. This delusion takes its name from the 1998 classic film The Truman Show, starring Jim Carrey. In this movie, Truman Burbank gradually discovers that every aspect of his life is being broadcast to millions of viewers around the world. While Truman Show disorder isn't an officially recognized diagnosis, it has garnered attention in both clinical settings and popular media due to a handful of reported cases. To put it simply, from a psychologist's or a psychiatrist's point of view, clinicians don't typically write Truman Show on a patient's chart. Instead, psychiatrists diagnose the condition that best fits the patient's symptoms. These are generally a psychotic disorder such as schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, delusional disorder, or bipolar disorder with psychotic features. In these cases, the belief of being monitored 24/7 functions as the delusional theme of the psychotic disorder rather than a standalone disorder itself. Symptoms can include an unshakable belief that one's life is being manipulated by outside forces, as well as heightened hypervigilance regarding cameras or believing people are actors. Individuals suffering from the delusion also may act in ways that are considered strange or unusual, given that they believe they're the star of a show, rather than just going about their life. This causes some people to completely withdraw socially in the hope of escaping perceived surveillance and the quote-unquote stardom they believe they have achieved. Notably, the Truman Show disorder itself is somewhat controversial. Because it isn't a recognized diagnosis, there's debate over whether giving it a label risks sensationalizing or trivializing a serious mental health issue. Some critics argue that focusing on the catchy name draws attention away from the broader issue of treating individuals with persecutory delusions. However, this criticism is by no means universal, and some argue that naming the phenomenon can help clinicians recognize the cultural context in which certain delusions arise.